Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 in a series of videos that are going to lead to making a fully functioning data entry and search GUI. I have the GUI built. It kind of looks like garbage right now, but we can worry about that at another point. Also, the GUI doesn't actually do anything. It's just got some labels and fields and some buttons, and that's it, okay? It's got this output area that doesn't do anything. This is based off of another file that you already have that's fully created. And when it's run, it looks like this, and it functions such that when we type words in and then submit them, they will add them to an array. And when we hit finish, it's going to take all the words out of that array and then append them to a text area. We then have a search bar up here where we can type a word that we want to find. And if we hit search, it's going to print that word out if it's found. If it's not found, it's going to say not found. Well, we want to add all of this functionality to that little bit of a GUI that we created in the last video. So the file that we're working on is the one that we created in the last video called dataInputsandSearch2. And just a really quick review, it was going to have some JPanels, some buttons, some fields, some labels, an output area. We did all the stuff in main that we always do in main. We had a method called setupGUI, which is broken down into 4 support methods or helper methods. Set up buttons, fields, labels, and panels, and those things did what you would expect. The buttons set up the buttons and add the action listeners to them. The fields set up the fields. The labels set up the labels, and the panels create our panels, set the border layout to the frame, and then add all of our components to those panels, and then finally add those panels to the frame. So we get that functioning GUI. Now, in order to make that GUI do something, we have to make the action performed do some stuff. Now, here's the deal. In order for this to work, what we need is an array, because what we're going to do is we're going to take input into that inputs field, and when a submit button is pressed, we want to take the data out of that field and add it into an index of an array. So let's start out by making our array. And we will call it input data. So it's going to be an array of strings, string array. I'm going to call it input data. All right. Next thing we're going to need is we're going to need an inputs counter. Because what we're going to do is every time something is input into that array, we're going to increment that counter by 1 or add 1 to it so that we can use that counter with our accessor. So it's going to choose which index of the array the data is going to go into. We'll worry about how it's going to be used in a little bit. It'll become more obvious, but let's just make it because we know we're going to need it. So we'll go private int input counter. Okay, those are the 2 things that we're going to need for sure. Now, let's get into the action performed. In action performed, I've got to deal with 3 different buttons. So that means I've got an if, else if, and else. Or I could make 3 ifs. Any way I want to do it is totally fine. So I'm going to go if e.getSource equals submit button, and do that. And then I'll do all the stuff for submit button in there. If e.getSource equals finish button, I'll get my code block there so that whatever I need to do for finish is going to go in there. And then lastly, if e.getSource equals search button, I'll make my code block and do whatever I need to do in there. Now you might ask, why didn't I do else ifs here? Well, I could, but I don't need to. Because action performed is only going to have one possible thing. It's going to be one of those 3 things, okay? It's not going to be something else. because those are the only three things that are going to have action performed. I could do else ifs, but it doesn't. It's totally not necessary, because if this is not true, it's not going to be able to do multiples of these at once, because it's not going to have multiple conditions that can be true. The source can only be one of those buttons. But if I want to, I could do this, else if, and it'll work exactly the same. Okay? So I've got my if-else tree set up. Now I'm going to decide what's going to happen. So when I submit, what I want to have happen is if I have something in this field and I press submit, all I want it to do is take that word, store it in my array, and then clear out that field. Okay? Nothing else. So let's figure out how we can do those things. We know that we want to access that array. All right? So our array is called input data. And whenever we're working with an array, we have to have the square braces for the accessor. All right? That means I have to choose an index where I want to put things in. You know, I could hard code in a value. Maybe I'll put it in 1, or maybe I'll put it in 0, or maybe I'll put it in 10. But how do I know where I'm going to put it? Well, earlier on, we created a variable that was called input counter. And I am going to initialize input counter to 0. All right? So that the first time I use input counter, it's going to be using index 0. So I'll go input counter. Now, when I press action performed, it's going to look at the input data at the input counter index, and we want to add something into it. Okay? And what I want to add to it is what's coming out of that text area, or that text field. And that text field was called input field. So I'm going to go get input field dot get text. Get text is a method that will retrieve whatever is in the field. So if I have something currently in this field, like the word, and if I were to hit submit, it would look what's in that field. It's going to see that string called word, and it's going to return it right to this point. So getText will return the string that is in that field to this point right here. Given that it's going to return a string, it's going to go into input data at the index that currently is at input counter. So if input counter is at 0 and I hit that button, it's going to get the text out of that field and add it to my array at index 0. Great. Now, once something was added in there, I want to update that input counter so that we don't always overwrite the data. Because if I don't update the input counter, what's going to happen is every time it's just going to keep adding it to index 0. So instead of doing that, I'm going to do this. Input counter plus plus. That will increment the input counter for us so that the next time around, input counter will be 1. So if I add something in there, I'm going to hit that button. It's going to add the thing from the input field into the array, and then the input counter gets updated. And then if I type something else in the field and then add it again, well, the input counter is no longer at 0, it's at 1. So it'll now add that new string into index 1 of my input data array. All right, pretty cool. Now, after we submit a whole bunch of stuff into our array, we can choose to finish everything out. So if you take a look at how our other one worked, is when we hit finish, what it did is it wrote all of the things in the array into this text area. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. In order to do that, I need to have a loop, because what we're going to do is traverse over the array, and for each element in that array, we're going to get that element and append it to the text area. So for int I is 0, while I is less than input data dot length I plus plus. So that's going to do a standard linear traversal. We've seen this now in a few different videos. So I'm traversing over all of the input data, and what I need to do is go output area dot append, and I want to get each string out of the input array. So input data at I. This is what makes it the traversal. We're using the control variable I here in our accessor here. So the first iteration through, we're going to get input data at 0 and append it to the output area. And then this is going to increment to 1. We'll get input data at 1. And it's going to go until we have no more input data left. There's one thing that I want to do is I just want to concatenate what's called a Newline escape sequence. This Newline escape sequence is just going to ensure that every time we append a new word, the next one is going to show up on a new line. Okay? Now, let's just leave that as is right now, and let's test it. I'm going to tell you this has an error. Before we do anything, before we test it, I want you to read through the code and see if you can figure out what that error is going to be. So, read through the code, pause, try and find that error. I'm going to run it, and we'll see what that error is. Oops, I'm running the wrong one. I'll run it, and I'm going to put words in here, submit, and I've got a null pointer exception. How many of you out there figured out before I ran this that it was going to be a null pointer? Now, we've seen null pointers before. We talked about it in a previous video, but let's look at it again. Let's figure out how to solve this problem. So this says Java lang null pointer exception, and it's happening at this point. So I'm going to click on this link here, and it's going to take me to the line where it showed up. So it's showing up on this line. And what that tells me is that one of these two objects is currently null. It's either input field is null or input data is null. Well, input field I know is not null because I created that field right here. So it's a real thing. It's been created. Input data, I think that might be null because I know I declared it right here, but I never actually instantiated it. So maybe in setup GUI, maybe I'll just do this right down here. I will go input data gets new string array, and I have to decide how long it's going to be. Now, I'll probably make a constant to do that, like I have been doing to avoid magic numbers. So private int num inputs. Now, not num inputs, I'll call it max inputs because it'll be the maximum number of inputs. So max inputs, and I'll say my max inputs is going to be 50 for this program. This is just an arbitrary number. You can decide on your own how many inputs it's going to be. Okay? So max inputs. There we go. So now it's instantiated, and let's test it again and see if it works. So my GUI shows up like it did before. I'm going to type in words, hit submit. That seems to work. It's not clearing that out yet. If I hit finish, it's going to print out words, then a whole bunch of nulls. Yuck. This is not really the way I want it to work exactly. It's got some quirks, or what you might call bugs. So we'll try and figure out how to clean up those bugs. The first bug that I want to address is that the field does not clear out when I hit submit. So let's try that. So let's go down to action performed, and that's going to be in my submit button thing. So I'm going to add the text from the text field onto my array, which works. I'm going to update my input counter, which works. Then I'm going to do this. Input field dot set text, and then do empty quotes. Okay, that will effectively clear that out. Now, let's deal with the finish button, and when we append all that stuff to our output. What we saw is it appended it appended that word that I added, but then a whole bunch of nulls. All of those nulls were all of those other elements in my array that never had anything added into them. So what I want to do here is only append a string to the array if and only if it is not null. Okay? Now I can do that right in here. I can go if input data at I does not equal null. This is called a null check. Okay? A null check is just checking to see if something in a variable is null. In this case, I'm checking to see if the string that's in the index here of my array is null. If it is null, we are just going to skip over it. If it's not null, we will get in here and we will add it. Now this isn't the most efficient thing, but it works for what we need to do. It's kind of a quick and dirty way of doing this. If I really wanted to make a more elegant program, I would. It would add a little bit more complexity to the code, a little bit outside of the skills that we're doing right now. Maybe if you were to take an object-oriented programming class, we would do something more elegant. But this is just going to be quick and dirty here. So let's test it and see if it works. Okay, so I'm going to type in words, submit. Hey, it cleared it out. Enter. Submit. And then finish. And it only typed out those words. Excellent. Now, what I saw in the other program that I made is that when finish was hit, we made it so that the submit button and the finish button no longer functioned, and we disabled them in effect. Okay, let's try and do that here. Okay, so if we hit finish button, what we want to do is disable these other buttons. I will go, what do we call it? Submit button dot set enabled. Set enabled is a method on the JButtons, and we can either set it to true or false. True means it's active and it works. False means that it is not enabled. It doesn't work. Okay? So submit button is currently disabled when I hit finish. And then I also want to disable the finish button. All right, now I've got some other buttons to deal with here. I haven't talked about the search yet, but I want to make sure that this search, it's not enabled until we have some things in here. I don't want anybody to be able to enter text in here or search anything until we've added some things into our array and we've finished doing our adding. So what I want to do is I want to, when I initialize my button, when I create my search button, I want to make it disabled, set enabled, false, so that by default, that thing is not enabled. Okay? So when I run this, you'll see that my initial state is the search button is disabled, I can't use it. But these things are enabled. So words, submit, hello, submit, search, submit, name, submit, and then finish, and then it disables these buttons. We can't do anything with this anymore, and our search button is still disabled. So when I hit finish now, I need to enable the search button. So let's go back down to action performed. Search button, set enabled, true. All right, now we've got a pretty much fully functioning GUI here. Everything works kind of the way I want it to work. It looks good. But there are going to be some things that we need to finish up in another video. So in the next video, I'm going to make a search function. We're going to create a method that will do something called a sequential search. And then we're going to call on that sequential search when the search button is pressed, and then we're going to update our search JLabel. And that'll be the end of this program and the end of this unit of videos. Thanks for watching, and tune in to that last video.